Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains somewhat familiar, actually. And today, we are going to discuss another hero of the railways. This is the story of John Axon. John Axon was an English train driver who was born on the 4th of December 1900 in Stockport, Cheshire. Originally, he worked as an apprentice painter and decorator, but in 1919 he joined the London and North Western Railway as a cleaner, and eventually becoming a fireman. Then in 1921, he was an engine driver, and he served with the London, Midland and Scottish Railway from 1923 after the grouping. And after 1948, he would continue in that role under British Railways. John was a highly experienced train driver. He'd been working on the rails for most of his life, and that wealth of knowledge when it came to locomotive operation would be put to the test on the 9th of February, 1957. On that day, he was on an outward trip from Stockport to Buxton. He was driving a Stanier Class 8F 280, number 48188. We've talked about the 8Fs before. They were incredibly good locomotives, the freight version of the Black 5. The train consisted of 33 wagons as well as a brake van on the rear. During the trip, Axon had noticed that there was a leak from the supply to the locomotive's steam brake, and at Buxton, he requested that it receive fitters' attention so they could make a temporary repair. Unfortunately, on the return trip back to Stockport, the repair didn't hold, and the steam pipe broke away from the steam brake and disabled the locomotive's brakes entirely, as well as the whistle. The damage was such that it filled the locomotive's cab with scalding steam, and it made it incredibly difficult for Axon or his fireman, Ron Scanlon, from reaching the controls to the engine. Back then, radios were not equipped on British rail locomotives. The crews in the front and the rear of any train would still use the whistle to communicate, as they had done over the last century. But even if they could get through the steam to get to the whistle, it wasn't working. At the time, they were headed up a steep bank, and there was a banking engine pushing from behind. The crew on that locomotive had no idea what was going on in the front of the train. Axon and Scanlon managed to partially close the regulator for the locomotive, as well as screw down the engine's tender brakes, but this didn't help at all. And they knew if they reached the top of the grade and started heading down the other side, there's no way they'd get the train to stop. The train wasn't going particularly fast, at least at that point, so Axon told Scanlon to jump off and attempt to apply some of the wagon brakes of the loose-coupled train. Scanlon managed to apply a few, but it still wasn't enough to stop the train from reaching the summit, and from there, the train began accelerating down the 1:58 gradient towards Chapel-en-le-Frith. The crew of the banking engine was horrified to see the rest of the train accelerate away from them, and the guard in the rear of the train tried desperately to apply the brakes in his van, but at that point there was nothing they could do. At the time of the failure, John Axon could have jumped. He could have saved himself along with his firemen. It was going slow enough that at worst he probably only would have suffered minor injuries. But Axon didn't do that. In an act that's eerily reminiscent of the legendary Casey Jones, Axon chose to stay with his engine and ride out the runaway train, hoping there was something he could do to at least alert people to get out of the way of a train that he had no way of stopping. Despite the continuing stream of scalding steam on the footplate, Axon remained alert, and he managed to wave a warning to the signalman at Dove Holes. This act actually enabled a DMU that was at Chapel-en-le-Frith station to be moved out of the way, but they couldn't warn the crew of a passing Roseley to Stockport freight service. They were going way too slow to outrun Axon's train, and 48188 slammed into the rear of that freight train. This sent multiple cars sailing off the line and derailed 48188. The brake van had been destroyed, and the accident killed John Creamer, who was the other freight train's guard, as well as driver John Axon himself. A nearby signalman barely escaped as 48188's tender actually sideswiped his signal box. As sad as that day was, the fact is, it could have been much worse, were it not for John Axon's actions that day. By remaining with the locomotive, he was able to alert people down the line of the emergency, and therefore minimize the damage overall. For this effort, he was awarded the George Cross on the 7th of May, 1957. His cross was eventually donated to the National Railway Museum in York in 1978. He was also awarded the Order of Industrial Heroism by the Daily Herald. He left behind a wife and 2 sons. He was the subject of a 1957 radio ballad known as The Ballad of John Axon that was written by Ewan McCall and Peggy Seeger, as well as being produced by Charles Parker. On the 19th of February 1981, a British Rail Class 86, number 86261, was named Driver John Axon GC at a ceremony held at Euston Station in London. In February 2007, a DMU Class 150, number 150273, was also named Driver John Axon GC at Buxton. That nameplate was actually passed on to a Class 156 DMU, 156460, and a plaque that commemorates the events was later unveiled and mounted at Chapel-en-le-Frith station. So like many of the heroes we talk about, John Axon should continue to be remembered, not just for his sacrifice, but for the lives he saved while doing so. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sundude 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fox, and Dimeblade 17. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.